Good evening. The topic of our lectures on today is population protection. Table of contents. Introduction. Population protection, which includes blast shelters, fallout shelters, how gas masks work, evacuation, and the work of the civil defense during peacetime. Introduction. Effective civil defense measures have the potential to reduce drastically casualties and economic damage in the short term and to speed a nation's economic recovery in the long term. Civil defense seeks to preserve lives, economic capacity, post-attack viability, and pre-attack institutions, authority, and values. The extent to which specific civil defense measures would succeed in doing so is controversial. So, population protection. Civil defense seeks to protect the population, protect industry, and improve the quality of post-attack life, institutions, and values. This section considers several measures that support these goals. People near potential targets must either seek protective shelter or evacuate from threatened areas to safer surroundings. If not at risk from immediate effects, they must still protect themselves from fallout. Both forms of protection depend on warning, shelter, supplies, life support equipment like air filtration, toilets, communication devices, instruction, public health measures, and provision for rescue operation. And addition, evacuation involves transportation. This section examines each form to protection. So, blast shelters. Some structures, particularly those designed or their purpose, offer substantial protection against direct nuclear effects like blast thermal radiation, ionizing radiation, and related effects such as induced fires. Science blast is usually the most difficult effect to protect against. Such shelters are generally evaluated on blast resistance, and protection against other direct effects is assumed. Since most urban targets can be destroyed by an overpressure of 5 to 10 psi, a shelter providing protection against an overpressure of about 10 psi is called a blast shelter, although many blast shelters offer greater protection. Other shelters provide good protection against fallout, but little resistance to blast. Such fallout shelters are discussed. Blast shelters generally protect against fallout, but best meet this purpose when they contain adequate life support systems. For example, a subway station without special provisions for water and ventilation would make a good blast shelter but a poor fallout shelter. Nuclear explosions produce rings of various overpressures. If the overpressure at a given spot is very low, a blast shelter is unnecessary. If the overpressure is very high, direct hit with the surface burst, even the best blast shelter will fall. The harder the blast shelter, That is, the greater the overpressure it can resist, the greater the area in which it could save its occupants' lives. Moreover, if the weapon height of burst is chosen to maximize the area receiving 5 to 10 psi, only a very small area or no area at all receives more than 40 to 50 psi. Hence, to attack blast shelters of 40 to 50 psi, which a reasonably attainable hardness, weapons must be detonated at a lower altitude, reducing the area over which buildings, factories are destroyed. The cost of blast shelters depend on the degree of protection afforded and on whether the shelter is detached or is in a building constructed for other purposes. However, a large variation in cost occurs between shelters added to existing buildings and those built as part of new construction. The installation of shelters in new construction or slanting is preferable, but it could take as long as 20 years for a national policy of slanting to provide adequate protection in cities. And an expensive way to protect population from blast is to use existing underground facilities such as sub-bays where people can be located for short periods for protection. If people must remain in shelters to escape fallout, then life support measures requiring special preparation are needed. Other lethal nuclear effects cannot be overlooked. Although is noted above, blast shelters usually protect against prompt radiation. The shelters must be designed to ensure that this is the case. Another problem to protection against fallout. If a sheltered population is to survive fallout, two things must be done. First, fallout must be prevented from infiltrating shelters through doors, ventilations, and other conduits. Other measures to prevent fallout from being tracked or carried into a shelter must also be taken. More important, the shelter must enable its occupants to stay inside as long as outside radiation remains dangerous. Radiation doses are cumulative, and a few brief exposures to outside fallout may be far more hazardous than constant exposure to a low level of radiation that might penetrate into a shelter. Science radiation may remain dangerous for periods from a few days to several weeks. Each shelter must be equipped to support its occupants for at least these times. Requirements include adequate stocks of food, water, and necessary medical supplies, sanitary facilities, and other appliances. Equipment for controlling temperature, humidity, and air quality standards is also critical. With many people enclosed in an airtight shelter, temperatures, humidity, and carbon dioxide content increase, oxygen availability decreases, and fetid materials accumulate. Surface fires, naturally hot or humid weather, or crowded conditions make things worse. If unregulated, slight increases in heat and humidity quickly lead to discomfort. Substantial rises in temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide over time could even cause death. Fires and also threat to shelters because of extreme term penetrates possibility excluding 2000 feet Fahrenheit, 2000 degrees of Fahrenheit, and carbon monoxide, and other noxious gases. A large fire might draw oxygen out of a shelter, suffocating shelterers. World War II experience indicates that rubble heated by a firestorm may remain intolerably hot for several days after the fire is put out. Fallout shelters. In the United States, fallout shelters have been identified predominantly in urban areas to protect against fallout from distant explosions, a Russia's attack on USA intercontinental ballistic missiles. On the other hand, Russian fallout shelters are primarily intended for the rural population and evacuated urban population. Fallout protection is relatively easy to achieve. Any shielding material reduces the radiation intensity. Different materials reduce the intensity by differing amounts. For example, the thickness in inches, of course, of various substances needed to reduce gamma radiation by a factor of 10 is steel 3.7, concrete 12, earth 18, water 26, wood 15. Consider an average home basement that provides a protection factor (PF) of 10, reduces the inside level of radiation to 1/10 of that outside. Without additional protection, a family sheltered have could still be exposed to dangerous levels of radiation over time. For example, after 7 days, an accumulated dose of almost 400 strains inside the basement would occur if the radiation outside totaled 4,000 Röntgens. This could be attempted to a relatively safe accumulated of 40 rains, if about 18 inches of dirt could be piled against windows and exposed walls before the fallout begins. 36 inches of dirt would reduce the dose of negligible level of 4 rains. Thus, DCPA knows fallout protection is cheap as dirt. Moving dry, unfrozen earth to increase the protection in a fallout shelter requires considerable time and effort if done by hand. A cubic foot of earth weighs about 100 pounds and cubic yard about 2.7 ounces. Given time, adequate instruction, and the required materials, unskilled people can convert home basements into effective fallout shelters. The overall effectiveness of fallout shelters therefore depends on having an adequate shelter, or enough time, information, and materials to build or improve an expedient shelter, having sufficient food, water, and other supplies to enable shelters to stay sheltered until the outside fallout decays to a safe level. They may need to remain in shelter for periods ranging from a few days to over 1 month, depending on fallout intensity, and entering the shelter promptly before absorbing much radiation. An individual caught by fallout before reaching shelter could have difficulty entering a shelter without contaminating it. Over the years, home fallout shelters have received considerable attention, with the government distributing plans that could be used to make home basement better shelters. Such plans typically involve pinning dirt against windows and, if possible, on floors above the shelter area, stocking provisions, obtaining radios and batteries, building makeshift toilets, and so forth. Such simple actions can substantially increase protection against radiation and may slightly improve protection against blast. However, few homes in the south and west have basements. With adequate time, instructions, and materials and experienced shelter offering reasonable radiation protection can be constructed. This is a built of semi-pure structure shielded from radiation by dirt and other common materials. Expedition shelter construction figures prominently in Russian civil defense planning. Now, short coffee break, 10 minutes. So let's have continue. How gas masks work. Anytime there is a threat or biological or chemical attack, the first thing you hear about is gas masks. Gas masks, more generically known as respirators, are also an important part of industrial safety on a daily basis. They protect workers against everything from floor dust and a grain elevator to the damaging organic chemicals in paint spray. Types of gas masks. When most people think about gas masks or respirators, what they usually envision is a tight-fitting plastic or rubber face mask with some sort of filter cartridge. The mask covers the nose and mouth. These are called half-mask air purifying respirators. Depending on the chemical or biological agents in the environment, a half mask may not be sufficient because the eyes are very sensitive to chemicals and offer an easy entry point for bacteria. In this case, a full-face respirator is called for. It provides a clear face mask or clear eye pieces that protect the eyes as well. A typical full-face air purifying respirator used here within hood and suit for extra protection. Air purifying respirators have two advantages. They are the least expensive option. They are the least complicated option. The problem with air purifying respirators is that any leak in the mask makes them ineffective. The leak could come from a pore fit between the mask and the user's face or from a crack or hole somewhere on the mask. Two other types of respirator systems solve the leak problems. The supplied air respirator uses the same sort of filter cartridge found in an air purifying respirator. However, instead of placing the filter directly on the mask and requiring the user's lungs to suck air through it, the filter attached to a battery-operated canister. The canister uses a fan to force air through the filter, and then the purified air runs through a hose to the mask. The advantage is that the air coming into the mask has positive pressure. Any leak in the mask causes purified air from the canister to escape, rather than allowing contaminated air from the environment to enter. Obviously, positive pressure creates a much safer system, but it has two disadvantages. If the batteries die, so do you. The constant airflow through the filter means that the filter doesn't last long. However, for infants and children, this may be the only option because the small faces make masks difficult to fit reliably. The best system is called an CSBA, self-contained breathing apparatus system. If you have ever seen a firefighter wearing a full face mask with an air tank on his or her back, then you have seen an SCBA system. The air tank contains high-pressure purified air and is exactly like the tank used by a scuba diver. The tank provides constant positive pressure to the face mask. As the SBA provides the best protection but has the following problems. The tanks are heavy and bulky. The tanks contain only 30 or 60 minutes of air. The tanks have to be refilled using special equipment. CSBA systems are expensive for firefighting, and CSBA system makes a lot of sense. The smoke is thick, dangerous, and contains an unknown mix of poisoning gases. The fire may consume most or all of the oxygen and the air. The fire engine can carry extra tanks or refilling equipment, and firefighters spend a limited time in the burning building. For civilians or for soldiers on the battlefield, however, an CSBA system is nearly impossible to manage because of the expense and the limited air time. How filters work? How filters work? Because of the problem with CSBA systems, any respirator that you are likely to use will have a filter that purifies the air you breathe. How does the filter remove poisonous chemicals and deadly bacteria from the air? Any air filter can use one or more of three different techniques to purify air: particle filtration, chemical absorption or adsorption, chemical reaction to neutralize a chemical. A typical disposable filter cartridge for a respirator. When you inhale, air flows through the inlet through a particulate filter, through an activated charcoal filter, through another particulate filter to trap charcoal dust, and through the outlet on the right into the mask. When the particulate filter clogs or the activated charcoal becomes saturated, you must replace the cartridge. Particle filtration is the simplest of the three. If you have ever held a cloth or handkerchief over your mouth to keep dust out of your lungs, you have created an improved particulate filter. In a gas mask designed to guard against a biological threat, a very fine particulate filter is useful. An anthrax bacteria or spore might have minimum size of 1 micron. Most biological particulate filters remove particle size as small as 0.3 microns. Any particulate filter eventually clogs, so you have to replace it as breathing becomes difficult. A chemical treat needs a different approach because chemicals come uh, uh, as mist or vapors that are largely immune to particulate filtration. The most common approach with any organic chemical, whether it be paint fumes or a nerve toxin like sarin, is activated charcoal. Charcoal is carbon. Activated charcoal is charcoal that has been treated with oxygen to open up millions of tiny pores between the carbon atoms. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the use of special manufacturing techniques results in highly porous charcoals that have surface areas of 300 to 2000 square meters per gram. These so-called active or activated charcoals are widely used to adsorb odors or colored substances from gases or liquids. The word absorb is important here. When a material absorbs something, it attaches to by chemical attraction. The huge surface area of activated charcoal gives it countless bonding sites. When certain chemicals pass next to the carbon surface, they attach to the surface and they're trapped. Activated charcoal is good at trapping carbon-based impurities, organic chemicals, as well as things like chlorine. Many other chemicals are not attracted to carbon at all, sodium and nitrates, to name a couple, so they pass right through. This means that an activated charcoal filter will remove certain impurities while ignoring others. It also means that once all of the bonding sites are filled and activated charcoal filter stops working. At that point, you must replace the filter. Sometimes the activated charcoal can be treated with other chemicals to improve its absorption abilities for a specific toxin. See this page for a discussion. The third technique involves chemical reactions. For example, during chlorine gas attacks in World War I, arms used masks containing chemicals designed to react with and neutralize the chlorine. According to this page, destruction by chemical reaction was adopted in some of the earliest protective equipment, such as the hypo helmet of 1915. Chlorine was removed by reaction with sodium thiosulfate, and the British and German masks of 1916. Phosgene was removed by reaction with hexamethyl tetramine. Short coffee break now. So let's have continue. Evacuation. Evacuation is conceptually simple. People move from high risk to low risk areas. In effect, evacuation or crisis relocation uses safe distances from protection from immediate nuclear effects. The effectiveness of crisis relocation is highly scenario dependent. If relocated people have time to find or build shelters, if the areas into which people evacuate do not become new targets, and if evacuated targets are attacked, evacuation will save many lives. Although evacuating is far less costly per capita than constructing blast shelters, planning and implementing an evacuation is difficult. First, people must be organized and transported to relocation areas. This is a staggering logistics problem. Unless people are assigned to specific relocation areas, many areas could be overwhelmed with evacuees, causing severe health and safety problems. Unless private transportation is strictly controlled, monument traffic jams could result. Unless adequate public transportation is provided, some people would be stranded in blast areas. Unless necessary supplies are at relocation areas, people might rebel against authority. Unless medical care is distributed among the relocation areas, health problems would multiply. Once evacuated, people must be sheltered. They might be assigned to existing public shelters or to private homes with basements suitable for shelter. If materials are available and time permits, new public shelters could be built. Evacuees require many of the same life support functions described previously under fallout shelters. Providing this sufficient quantity would be difficult. Evacuation entails many unknowns. The time available for evacuation is unknown but extremely critical. People should be evacuated to areas that will receive little fallout, yet fallout deposition areas cannot be accurately predicted in advance. Crisis reluctant could increase the perceived rate of nuclear war, and this might destabilize a crisis. Whether people would obey in evacuation order depends on many factors, especially public perception of a deteriorating international crisis. If an evacuation were ordered and people were willing to comply with it, would time allow compliance? If the attack came while the evacuation is underway, more people might die than if evacuation had not been attempted. Sufficiency of warning depends in circumstances of US President might order an evacuation only if the Russians had started one. In this case, the United States might have less evacuation time than the Russians. The abundance of transportation in the United States could, in theory, permit faster evacuation, but panic, traffic jams, and inadequate planning could nullify this advantage. Disorder and panic, should they occur, would impede evacuation. The successes of evacuation in the United States would likely vary from region to region. Generally, evacuation requires little planning in sparsely populated areas. In some areas, especially the Midwest and South, evacuation is feasible but requires special planning because fallout from attacks or ICBMs might mean longer evacuation distances. Evacuation from the densely populated Boston to Washington and Sacramento to San Diego corridors. With their tens of millions of people and limited relocation areas may prove impossible. The Russia rapidly has plans for a large-scale evacuation of cities, and recent debate on its effectiveness has stimulated discussions of a similar plan known as crisis relocation for the United States. Some key considerations are: tactical warning of a missile attack does not give enough time for evacuation. Evacuation plans thus assume that an intense crisis will provide several days strategic warning of an attack, and that the leadership would make use of this warning. Unlike in place blast sheltering, place time expenditures on evacuation are relatively small, since most expenditures occurs only when a decision has been reached to implement plans. Evacuation involves considerably more pre-attack planning than a shelter-based civil defense plan, as logistical and other organizational requirements for moving meal joints of people in a few days are much more complex. Plans must be made to care for the relocated people. People must know where to go. Transportation or evacuation routes must be provided. A recent survey of the US population revealed that many would spontaneously evacuate in a severe crisis, which could interfere with the planned evacuation. The work of the civil defense during peacetime, providing relief to the affected people in emergency situations, training the volunteers to carry out the acts of civil defense, organizing the rules and the means of industrial safety and security, firefighting, fire extinguishers, ambulance, establishing operating room centers for civil defense and identifying the necessary specification and supervisions of the shelters to protect the population, creating and preparing the civil defense formations of different measures and processing it with the necessary equipment and means, storage of various materials and equipment necessary to sustain life in war, emergencies, and disastrous situations, the preparations and implementations of the necessary action that aim to achieve safely and to avoid disasters and to remove its effects in addition to providing cash subsidy. Use the media to achieve the objectives of civil defense. Implementation of the plan of evacuation and accommodation in emergency cases. That's it. Thanks for your attention. Bye.